Okay, that's my cue from our director. Welcome everybody to UNBC's Terrace campus. This is, I believe, the second in our series of public presentations for the winter semester. And today we're pleased to have Ann Travers from Simon Fraser University with us, with support from the Terrace Women's Resource Center. And I see they've brought tea and cookies at the back as well. So thanks to Alina and others for setting that up and making this possible. So Ann joins us, like I said, from SFU, where she's an associate professor. She tells me, or perhaps I should say they tell me, this is one of the trends you have to get used to in dealing with the non-polar gender identification issue. I still never know the correct pronoun to use, but they tell me that they are from Toronto originally, and did their PhD at
You're doing great.
University of Oregon.
Almost getting to an A.
And it's a real challenge. I think the Swedes have a better solution. They just invented a new word. So they are an associate professor in the Department of Sociology. And they are on a book tour with books for sale and for signing after, and discussion welcome as well. So with that, I will just turn it over to Ann to take it where she wants to. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. I want to pause for a moment and thank Elena Kazuga for all the hard work that she has done to enable my visit. I really appreciate it. This is sort of funny. They want me here for the live stream, but this is more comfortable. You'll move. But before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory of the Tsimshian First Nation. As a white settler, I have a great deal to learn about the real history of BC, and I'm certainly working really hard to learn more about that. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll stop, and we can have a discussion, questions and answers. I begin by taking you to an August afternoon in 2011, where I found myself at a AAA baseball game in the US Southwest, standing in line at the concession stand with my daughter. The kid in front of me turned around suddenly and caught this involuntary look of surprise in my eyes and cheerfully called me on it, saying, "You thought I was a boy, didn't you?" And I responded, "I thought you looked like me when I was your age." She was an unmistakably queer kid. She went on to tell me that people think that she's a boy all the time, and she's okay with it, but her mom hates that she keeps her hair so short. We chatted for a bit, but when we got close to the front of the line, I switched gears and I got serious, and I said, "I want you to remember me. I want you to remember that I told you that one day, probably when you go to university, you are going to meet lots of people like us, and they will love you, and your life will be great." And we didn't say anything for a few seconds. I felt like I'd done something really important. I felt like I'd reached across time to do for her what no one had done for me. It felt really empowering and deeply meaningful until a little later that day when I realized how unbelievably elitist it was of me to assume that a university escape plan was in her future. The light at the end of the tunnel that I attempted to provide this presumably white kid came from my story, which is based on a combination of race and class privilege and good timing. But the majority of queer and trans kids will never attend post-secondary school. This kid's parents might not have the resources to send her to college. After all, her dad ran the concession at the ballpark. But her gender nonconformity and her age, just on the cusp of puberty when so-called tomboys experience the beginning of a lot of pressure to conform to feminine norms, made me worried for her, and I wanted to throw her a lifeline. Trans kids are present in every population, and I like to tell people, if you worked with kids or you've been around kids, whether you know it or not, you have been around trans kids. Most of the time they don't make themselves known because the cost in terms of discrimination and safety are too great. It's better they've decided to hide themselves than risk exclusion or violence. And this produces the logic of the Thomas theorem, whereby situations that are defined as real become real in their consequences. People say, you know, we don't have any trans kids here, and that attitude makes the trans kids who are actually here fade into the background. Ultimately, both the trans kids who make themselves visible and the trans kids who are invisible are vulnerable to self-harm, suicide, discrimination, and violence. It's important to note that the self-harm and suicide that they are at increased risk of is not because they are trans, because being trans is a normal gender variation and is certainly nothing new, as my colleague Julian Gill-Peterson documents in Histories of the Transgender Child. It's the negative response that trans kids experience that makes them want to harm themselves or kill themselves. I identify as trans non-binary. For the past 7 years, I've been attending conferences and meetings for trans kids and their families, conducting interviews, participating in online groups, and publicly advocating for queer and trans kids, as well as LGBT people in general. My book is fairly unique in that I rely on interviews from trans kids and also from parents of trans kids. I interviewed 19 trans kids and 23 parents of trans kids in Canada and the United States between 2012 and 2017. So my overall sample consists of 36 kids. They live in various regions of Canada and the United States and range in age from 4 to 20. Most of them come from middle-class families, but at least 5 are working class, several of whom are living in poverty. Of these kids, 15 are Euro-Canadian or Euro-American, meaning they're racialized as white, while the remainder are racialized to some degree as non-white, 13 of them visibly so. It's crucial to situate trans kids within broader relations of power and oppression. Canada and the United States occupy huge, varied, and contested geographical spaces. Both nations brand themselves as democracies, but each is more accurately understood as a white settler society, albeit with different histories of displacing, committing genocide against indigenous populations, and subjugating racialized minorities. These histories provide a crucial genealogy of contemporary socioeconomic inequality. Today I'm going to start talking about 3 trans kids in particular, Ren, Finn, and Hunter, to emphasize the importance of paying attention to the ways that varying degrees of social inequality impact the life chances of trans kids. The hostility to children who are assigned male at birth but express feminine qualities has been keenly felt by kids like Ren. When I first interviewed Ren at age 7, she told me, "I was born a boy, but I like being a girl." Ren actually wishes she'd been left alone and not forced to identify herself as any gender, but she produced gender confusion in other people, and their insistence on making it her problem produced so much anxiety for her that she just said, "I'm going to identify as a girl. I can't handle this." When I asked her about a vision of herself in the future, however, she was very matter-of-fact in explaining that she doesn't see transgender womanhood as a viable option in the future. She told me that she planned to change back into a boy when she turned 10. I was a bit surprised to hear this, given how stereotypically feminine she is, although I never doubt anyone's assertion about their gender identity. When I interviewed her again at age 11, her timeline for changing back had shifted, but the vision of her future had not. She was operating in stealth mode, meaning secretly, at a new school, and now planned to change back into a boy at 14 or 15. Ren explains why she doesn't believe that she can be a trans woman in the future, saying, "I'm black. I don't want to be trans too." The burden of racism combined with trans negativity is just too much for her to bear when she looks ahead. Finn also saw no future for himself, literally. Brace yourselves, this is a tough story. Over a year ago, I learned, via his mother's heartbreaking announcement in an online parent group, that Finn had committed suicide. I obtained permission from his mom, Heidi, to read some of what she wrote. It's been 5 weeks since my 14-year-old transgender son took his life. We had a discussion that night at dinner about his next puberty blocker shot and how we were going to pay for it since we'd just gotten a letter of our second denial of state insurance and had been told by the drug's owner company that we were slightly over income. So we wouldn't qualify for a bursary. We couldn't afford the $1,400 a month out-of-pocket payment. He begged me to do a GoFundMe for him, but I told him we couldn't do it for something ongoing. He left the table upset. Oh, how I wished I would have checked in on him. But he spent most of his time holed up in his room, and I was trying to be respectful by not intruding. Later that night, while I slept in the next room, he quietly left the house and walked to the railroad a few blocks away and lay his body across the track. It was the 11 o'clock train. Finn found puberty so difficult to bear, and faced with what he saw as limited options for the future, he chose death. I was struck by the power of his will. This was not a suicide attempt to call for help. He was done. He was out. Given the circumstances he foresaw for himself, he didn't see a point in going on to live. And his mom agreed, saying that she was struck by the mere determination of his will, what it would have taken to stay on the tracks. Heidi described Finn as gifted and wise, but lacking the maturity to manage his considerable emotional sensitivity, saying he had to lay down that load he was carrying somehow. The hopelessness he felt in the road ahead of him is what broke him that night. But even if he had no problem getting puberty blockers, he still had his internal demons. But if the barriers to taking puberty blockers were not there, I don't think he would have died that night. Family acceptance is known to be the most significant factor in shaping mental health outcomes for trans kids. But the socioeconomic status of their families is also key. Activist parents of trans kids have played a very significant role in generating environments where it has become possible for more trans kids to show themselves. These activists do many of the following. They educate themselves and other family members and friends and people in positions of authority. They affirm and support trans kids and the family as a whole in the face of trans negativity. They run interference. They protect kids from anti-trans aggressions, large and small. They locate and access appropriate resources. They help kids recover from trauma. They coach kids to handle the situations they encounter and to build resilience. And they work for social change to increase safety in spaces and institutions. About her daughter, Taya, Luna explains that, "My most raw fear is for her safety and well-being. I fear the intolerance that I am seeing in the world, and I guess even though I strongly believe, and all the research is coming out now to say affirmation is the best parenting path, there are always the people who call me late at night, send email, or drop hand-delivered letters in my mailbox that say, 'You will be responsible if there is a terrible outcome.' Like if somebody harms your kid, if your kid harms herself, it will be on your head because you didn't discourage them from this path." And I guess there's just always that little nagging feeling of, is this the best that I can do in terms of assuring her confidence, all my kids' confidence, that they absolutely have the right to be whatever they are and absolutely have the right to engage with the world in a far more equitable way? Sometimes there are days when the outside world feels like it has so much more power than I do. This undercurrent of fear is one thing that parents of all vulnerable children have in common. But some parents have more capacity, resources, and skills to respond to it than others. Parents of trans kids have to anticipate problems before they happen if they're to spare their kids even some of the damaging consequences. This means that parents do a lot of behind-the-scenes work, like meeting with the kindergarten teacher before the kid shows up at school. They spend a great deal of time and energy trying to make their children's schools safer and more welcoming. Some even do free workshops for staff to train them to be more gender inclusive. Other parents do this work less formally by meeting with teachers and school staff, drawing their attention to resources, connecting them. But many parents, via this labor, provide pretty valuable no-cost resources to institutions, and they also provide these resources to other parents. Online parent networks and conferences for kids and families of trans kids are places where resource sharing takes place. Parents of trans kids also experience collateral loss, some of the fallout from the discrimination their kids experience. It's not unusual for them to experience decreased economic security. Sometimes parents have to stop working in order to take care of their kid or advocate for the kid. They can face loss of opportunities for professional advancement, loss of family and friends. They can experience parental overload and compromised mental and physical health. They can lose activities, spaces, feelings of community, and feelings of safety and privacy. I've heard reports about grandparents, best friends, aunts, uncles, and cousins who've been barred from the house for their refusal to use correct pronouns and names, to stop asking why, or to stop making anti-trans statements. Parents work so hard to create more safety for their children outside the home, but the one place most of them are able to exert control is at their front door. Granted, doing so requires economic independence from family members, and that's obviously not always the case. Catherine explained, "I'm at a place now where I'll have the conversation, I'll be supportive, and I'll be kind, and I'll remind you, but there comes a point where get on board or get out of the house, because I'm sick of this." Catherine has had to tell her parents and her sister that they can't come over anymore because they kept saying she. Nathan's mom, Nora, echoes this sentiment, describing how she kicked a friend out of her house for refusing to call Nathan by his name, telling her, "Jane, if you don't get the fuck out of my house now, I will be arrested here tonight." Being unable to keep our children safe is a devastating experience for parents. Frank, Catherine's son, was the victim of a violent anti-trans sexual assault, and this sent shockwaves through his entire family. The resulting stress required Catherine to go on long-term disability. As her family's sole breadwinner, this put them in poverty. She described the severity of the poverty they endured in the aftermath of the assault, saying, "We lost our car and we had to move to a cheaper place in a worse neighborhood. We were chopping up furniture." Catherine dreams of moving to a big city and leaving their small town behind, but the monumental tasks of finding a new job and securing housing are more than she can handle at the moment. She explained, "When you've been kicked down, it's hard. I don't believe in myself anymore. Like, I always felt pretty strong and pretty confident, and that's gone right now. I don't feel like, fuck this, we can move and I'll find work and we'll be good. I don't feel that way anymore." Speaking of her inability to protect Frank, she said, "It killed me. I will never be the same person." Still, the parents I interviewed talked about the benefits that they and their families have gained as a result of having a trans kid. This includes feelings of empowerment in that they begin to feel that they can change things in their environment that they don't like, the personal and relationship growth that's resulted, and connections to activist and support communities. While trans rights have been enshrined at the federal level in Canada and in all but 2 provinces, the current hateful shift in the political landscape of the United States, the election of right-wing governments in Ontario and Quebec, and ongoing anti-SOGI movements continue to put trans kids at risk. But many pro-LGBT campaigns focus exclusively on white and financially secure queer and trans kids. But the impact of racism and or poverty makes some queer and trans kids more vulnerable than others. Dan Savage's It Gets Better campaign, for example, which was initiated in response to the highly public suicide of gay teens, has been criticized for speaking only to those LGBT kids who are otherwise privileged. It fails to acknowledge that for many visible minority and poor LGBT people, young people, it doesn't get better. As they grow to adulthood, they remain dogged by discrimination and poverty. They continue to be vulnerable to self-harm and suicide, and are disproportionately at risk of spending time in prison. Advances in LGBT rights have taken place at the same time that we've seen widening social inequality, the expansion of prison systems that target people who are Indigenous, Black, poor, and/or mentally ill, ongoing colonial relationships with Indigenous peoples, and severe cutbacks to public education and services. Hillary, a parent, reflected on the politics of race and class privilege, observing that our society prioritizes the righteousness of white mothers defending their children in a way that we don't for Black and Indigenous mothers. However radical the more mainstream appearing activist moms of trans kids may actually be, their ability to project as non-threatening and respectable via their whiteness, their relative class privilege, and their appearance as at least seemingly heterosexual enables them to intervene on behalf of queer and trans kids in uniquely powerful ways. Trans and queer adults certainly have played a major role in pushing schools to be more LGBT inclusive, but the power of these so-called normal moms to challenge schools and other institutions to change the way they do gender and sexuality cannot be overstated. But Kai, a parent and an LGBT youth worker, asks, how do we protect young people who don't have privileged activists as parents? Sometimes the political awakening that parents of trans kids experience as a result of their children's vulnerability is limited to gender, and even then it fails to be critical of sexism, gender inequality, and heterosexual norms. Troublingly, at least before the 2016 US presidential election and the increased visibility of anti-LGBT white supremacists, not an insignificant number of white parents took it for granted that the main threat to the safety of their trans kids comes from communities of color. This defies reality. As political scientist Kimberly Manning points out, the relatively few numbers of parents of color publicly advocating for their transgender children is not due to cultural mores more conservative than those found in religiously conservative white families and communities, as is sometimes suggested, but rather a direct outcome of racist structures that exhaust and exclude. But parent activists of relatively privileged trans kids can use their child's experience of oppression to develop awareness and support for other marginalized groups. I attended the Gender Odyssey Adult and Family Conference in Seattle several years ago, for example, and I found myself listening to a powerful keynote by an Asian American trans woman, a former president of San Francisco Pride, who spoke about her experiences of family rejection, poverty, self-hatred, discrimination, racism, and survival sex work. As I listened, I found myself looking around at the 200 or so people in the room. They appeared to be equal parts white, middle-class, heterosexual couples who parent trans kids, and a somewhat racially diverse group of trans and queer adults. I watched with something close to astonishment as many of these parents, these heterosexual parents, earnestly nodded with recognition and seeming personal connection to the historical touchstones in LGBT history that the speaker referenced, such as the Stonewall Riot and the central role that trans women of color played in leading the fight against anti-gay police violence. I know that many parents make space for their trans kids because they already have critical perspectives on gender and histories of engagement with social justice issues more broadly. But I'm certain that some come late to this party, and this fills me with hope that knowledge of the ways that environments and institutions harm their otherwise privileged children will connect them to other social justice struggles so that they will more effectively support all trans kids. In the awful 2 years since the 2016 presidential election, with disturbing attacks on trans kids and adults and on racialized, undocumented, and religious minorities, and the subsequent election of Doug Ford in Ontario, and the setbacks for vulnerable kids this has entailed, I've wondered if social movements made up of parents of trans kids will be willing and able to form coalitions with other vulnerable groups. I view the care work of parenting as protecting the vulnerable by definition. To use a metaphor I loathe for a moment, that of the lifeboat, I ask, how do we get all the kids in the boat? I've never felt a greater sense of purpose than I do as a parent, and I honestly fear how I would react to a situation in which only a few children could get in the boat. I think it's quite likely that I would do practically anything to get my own kids in the boat. And this isn't because I think that there's anything unique about them, but they're mine. And it doesn't really encourage a lot of logic and reflection. But we need to go past the idea of a lifeboat, because this idea that we have finite resources that, in terms of enabling all kids to thrive, is not actually true. It's an imaginary circumstance that only some kids can have enough resources to thrive while others can't. Widespread social inequality is something that has been made as a result of human action, and it's possible to change this. I don't believe for a second that any of us would deny Finn, Ren, Hunter a place in the boat. But making space for them requires us to build a much bigger boat, and to do this, we need to work with other marginalized communities to support the many vulnerable kids in our midst and the vulnerable adults they will grow up to be. Within the context of the larger goal of producing a radical shift towards intense social and material investment in all children, we have 3 key tasks. We need to generate room for all kids to determine their own gender identities within a wider range of possibilities. Second, we need to transition environments away from the binary gender system while respecting and supporting people for whom binary identity is meaningful. It's not necessary to line kids up in terms of boy and girl categories. I don't understand why my 10-year-old can't be playing in a soccer league with people of all genders, but there just aren't any in Vancouver at his level. So one of the things that we can do, knowing that most trans kids are invisible, is to stop gendering the environments children circulate in, so that you're not forcing them to experience trauma every time they have to decide to participate in an activity or engage in a task. And third, finally, we need to put the most vulnerable trans kids at the center of our social change efforts. It seems to be the opposite. The kids that circulate in the media and social media are disproportionately wealthy with parental support. So if policymakers are responding to those kids, if teachers and schools are responding to those kids, well, those kids will definitely be better. The changes that can result are literally life-altering for those kids. But it doesn't trickle down to kids who are more vulnerable. On the other hand, if we imagine that among the most vulnerable populations there are trans kids there, and think about what we need to do to make sure that those kids are okay in every respect, the more privileged trans kids are definitely going to benefit. So I encourage us to change the direction of social change around. We have to invest culturally and materially in the most vulnerable kids and their families by establishing a baseline of security for all, not only by reversing cuts to social services, school budgets, community centers, and healthcare services, but by recommitting to and radically expanding a welfare state model. Components of this model include guaranteed housing and basic income for all, a public, not-for-profit model of healthcare, and equitable nation-to-nation relationships with Indigenous peoples that include reparations for land theft and genocide. Thinking in terms of the most vulnerable trans kids is a powerful orientation for a vision of a more just and equitable future for all of this. And there are examples where this is being done. In Finland, for example, the Finnish government's response to immigrant populations is to throw even more resources than they throw at regular kids towards immigrant kids to enable them to receive top-notch education and enter professions. So rather than those kids being on the margins and receiving less resources, they actually receive the most. When I traveled by car from Canada to the US in early 2016, a white, visibly gender nonconforming, designated female at birth, middle-class Canadian citizen with my black daughter in the car, I felt confident in my own power in the world. So confident that when I realized I'd forgotten my passport, I didn't panic. I told my daughter that I expected to be let through, but I was careful to point out that this would be because of my whiteness and visible class privilege, and that, unjust as it is, it would be unsafe for her to approach the border with the same sense of entitlement when she's old enough to travel on her own. As if to prove my point, the border agent cheerfully allowed me through with just my driver's license. This is what entitlement feels like: confidence and positive expectation that everything will be okay. This is not something that many trans kids will ever experience. As I prepared to undertake a subsequent cross-border trip with my daughter, the first Sunday after the 2016 presidential election, I worried about my phone being searched and about my gender issues. Nothing untoward happened that day, but the experience of anxiety was significant in itself. I realized I'd gotten used to being seen as respectable. That Sunday, the Black American preacher at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Seattle delivered a powerful sermon about the necessity of principled action for social justice. Speaking to a primarily black congregation steeped in the intergenerational trauma of ongoing white supremacy, he acknowledged the temptation to give in to cynicism and hopelessness. But he urged the congregation to go beyond hope, to engage in the politics of the brokenhearted, to stand in the tragic gap between cynicism and idealism. I believe that that gap is where most parents of particularly vulnerable kids live. I find it heartbreaking that Ren sees no future for herself as a black trans woman. But I see flashes of possibility and resilience in her. When we were talking about the difficulties involved in being different, Ren observed that these same difficulties can be gifts. When I asked her if she thinks being trans is a gift, she said, "I've heard of gifted as in magical, like a mutant. If you're transgender, you are basically kind of like a mutant. Some things are harder for you, but there are things that you can do that are amazing because you're special, like you're an X-Man." I hope that Ren will someday find a way to claim all of herself. For all I know, she will do this by coming to see herself literally as some kind of an X-Man. But it's not enough to hope for this. If we don't address the racism as well as the anti-trans discrimination she's likely to face, her future remains quite uncertain. Thank you. I'm going to move over here now. I have to start by saying how impressed I am that the room is full during reading week. This would not be the case at my university, where everybody scampers away. So it's quite impressive. Elena asked me to mention that there are resources from TransCare at the back of the room.
Does anyone have any questions for him?
Thank you so very much for touching on this fascinating topic. We should have had a seminar like this 20 years ago. What shocks me from day to day and continues to shock me is how widespread globally the violent reaction against trans people occurs. And the media, when they do report it, they of course they concentrate on the most atrocious violent incidences in Asia and in Africa. And they almost make it seem like it is something in human nature that elicits that violent counter-reaction, something perhaps with social biological roots. And what they hardly ever report are those few exceptions, cultures where there is little or no violent reaction. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps comment a little bit on those cultures and what makes them special.
I'm not, I don't have expertise on gender and sexuality systems globally in terms of the individual cultures. I'm certainly aware of a number of cultures that have far more flexible systems for gender and sexual identity. But what I can speak to is the global impact of colonialism. One of the impacts of colonialism in Canada, the US, and the other white sister settler nations of Australia and New Zealand and South Africa is that it involved the violent imposition of Eurocentric binary gender systems. People who did not fit those systems were particularly targeted for violence and abuse by white settlers and white settler governments. We also know that, for example, some of the really anti-gay campaigns, really harsh anti-gay campaigns that are occurring in Africa right now were prompted by US evangelical leaders visiting those places and offering money and resources. I actually found out that this is actually true, and the same with Russia. The same guy who was the head of the Oregon Citizens Alliance when I was doing my doctorate in Eugene, Oregon in 1990, when there was a ballot measure to make it illegal to speak about homosexuality without condemning it if you were in a publicly funded institution. The same guy who wrote that ballot measure, which thankfully failed, wrote the Russian anti-gay laws, because the language is so similar. So, there's a sense in which one way in which progressive people engage in racism is thinking that white people are progressive, and that, you look to other countries around the world and you see these unbelievable acts of violence against people who have less traditional gender or sexual identities, ignoring the kind of violence that often occurs in Western countries towards those same people. But it also, it's ignorant of history, of the role of colonialism in enforcing binary gender systems on people all over the globe. You see that footprint everywhere. So, I'm a sociologist who believes deeply in understanding history. And to understand history, you need to hear from voices that are silenced to understand what has really happened. Yeah.
Your talk, and I'm assuming your book too, I don't know if it goes into, you talk a lot about the parents who are understanding and working with their children. My question has to do with, what about the kids who, they are the most marginalized? Their families also don't either have anything to do with them, or when they come home, it's the family member who says he instead of she, or Amy instead of Frank.
Those kids mostly don't even show themselves. It does happen though. There are kids who, there are some kids who can't hide. They just can't hide. It doesn't matter what they do, they're going to be read as gender nonconforming, and they're going to get social censure for that, often from their families. And it used to be that those kids, sometimes their parents would take them for conversion therapy, take them to a psychiatrist. There are a number of government-funded programs like the UCLA Feminine Boys Study, and until recently at CAMH in Toronto, where parents who didn't want their kids to be trans or gender nonconforming would take them and have someone provide psychiatric treatment to make them conform. And one of the biggest ways of making them conform would be to withdraw attachment. Like, if you want mom and dad to pay attention to you and love you, you have to stop doing these stereotypically female things, and you have to, which, as we know, is unbelievably damaging for children's development, the lack of attachment, using attachment as a weapon. At least it's not legal to do that anymore in Canada. But still, some parents and families are doing it just because they hate who their kid is. But I think really the most vulnerable kids are the ones who they just know there's just no place for them. I interviewed one guy who was 19 and he was homeschooled in a fundamentalist Christian family out in the middle of nowhere. And he literally had no access to anybody else until he managed to meet some other trans people in an online writing group when he was 14 or 15. And when he told his parents at 18 that he was trans, he was out of the house. They disowned him. It was over. And the thing is, he knew this was going to happen, so he made arrangements, he had a plan, but literally, like, he was packed, and it wasn't an overreaction. We certainly know that there is a disproportionate number of LGBT kids among street kid populations. That the reason that most people leave home when they're young, when they're children or teens, is because home is a really dangerous, horrible place. That's why most kids leave home, and there are a disproportionate number who are LGBT.
You mentioned the politics of the brokenhearted. I think that's a beautiful and tragic phrase, but I'm just wondering what initiatives you've seen in BC or anywhere in Canada that are really positive that I think are moving in the right direction.
I was involved in Vancouver, where I live. The Vancouver School Board in 2014 was updating its gender and sexual diversity policy. It already had an anti-homophobia policy, but the policy was designed to, the new policy to allow trans kids to use whatever bathroom they felt necessary, to support the creation of more gender-neutral bathrooms, to require teachers and school personnel to use the pronouns that a child asked for and to use the name they asked them to use, those kinds of things. And it was pretty amazing because, I mean, there was a very, very well-mobilized Christian right response against it. I mean, people were bussing in from all over to protest under the guise of, parents' rights. Like, the school doesn't get to say if it's okay for a kid to be trans or gay, parents do. And I was part of a real groundswell of LGBT people and our allies in the city who came to those meetings with the school board, made petitions. I made a petition, lots of other people did. So the amendment passed, which was, a good thing, even though there is, I think, like a quarter of a staff person assigned to assist schools and staff in making those policies a reality. So it literally didn't have much impact. I remember when my own son enrolled in grade 1 in a new school halfway through the year, and the teacher, who was otherwise a very lovely person, immediately told him, "This is where the boys play with Lego. You'll want to go here." And I was like, ah. And of course he wanted to play with Lego, so just to bug me, but no, I mean, like, he likes Lego. That's not the problem. He can like Lego. He should be able to like Lego, but I mean, so should anybody else. But what happened a couple years later was when the BC government was cutting back its budget to school boards, a whole bunch of things were on the chopping board. One was this gender and sexual diversity mentor quarter-time position. But along with this position, you had cuts to the early literacy worker. I mean, this is somebody who you had that would all these other supports. And one of the things that made me incredibly happy at the tragically happy at the hearing that the school board held to hear community concerns was I saw people who had been in support of that gender and sexual diversity, what's the word? Upgrade, all around the room representing other groups. And what I didn't hear was any competitiveness. Everybody who spoke in support of the early literacy worker or school libraries or the anti-homophobia mentor or the Aboriginal support worker, they spoke about the necessity of maintaining all these positions. There wasn't a sense in which people were saying, you need to protect trans and gay kids more than kids who are racialized or more than kids from immigrant families. There was a recognition that all these categories overlapped. And in a sense, I found that quite heartening. I mean, the band and strings program was being cut, and they just spoke about them. But I'm sure everybody could enjoy band and strings. But still, instead of arguments about, you know, why our thing is the most important, everyone came and argued about why the particular resource that they were speaking about was important, but they said they all are, and they talked at length about how they were all important for the well-being of children in the district. I think that is a little bit, I think that's helpful. I've also watched in my own community, everyone remember Tamara Taggart from the news? Her kid is in my kid's class, so I've gotten to know her a little bit. Her son has Down syndrome. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is watching as her activism on behalf of disabled kids in schools, she ended up taking a really sort of frontline role in tackling the really, really homophobic and transphobic statements that people were making. So in this sense, it was really cool to see how, you know, her activism around disabled children, because she has a son who is understood as disabled, it translated to another population. And I think, who is better equipped to take this than Tamara Taggart? She's white, she's heterosexual, she's well-known, she's like, you know, kind of a Teflon person, somebody who's not particularly vulnerable to criticism. And for her to step forward, I think is really important. At the same time, without sort of, you know, speaking for and taking over the agenda, which she didn't do, because I know that sometimes white people, we think we're doing something so great by speaking about racism as if we actually understand how it operates on the receiving end. And if we're not learning from people of color, then we're not being very effective allies. But I've seen how she translated her personal experience into effective allyship. And that's just one example I have. And there are many more. Yep.
Can I follow up on my introductory remarks and talk about pronouns?
Mm-hmm.
How important are pronouns? How did we end up with them and they when we're looking for really a gender-neutral term, which I think we could all agree on the need for, but now we have this ambiguity about singular or plural in the traditional English language.
Well, you know, English has changed so much over the centuries, it doesn't really bother me that we're changing it again. Because we have used they. I mean, if we don't know what gender someone is, it's not unusual to say they. The idea of having to pick between only two pronouns is, you know, it's not a universal, it's not inevitable, there's a way to change it. I remember being struck by Marge Piercy's novel, I think it was published in 1979, Woman on the Edge of Time, and she had a utopian society as part of that novel, and people referred to each other as per, like short form for person. And I thought, oh. And there are, you know, science fiction is often some of the most interesting social theory because people feel really free to just let loose with their ideas. So, you know, it's quite possible that more pronouns will emerge, and in fact they have. And one of the things that I have to say that's so exciting and interesting about interviewing trans kids and young people is that they know everything about the new pronouns, and there are so many of them that I haven't heard before, and they take incredible pleasure in educating me about them. And what I see then is that, you know, many trans and queer young people are participating in the shaping of new language that creates more room for people. So I do think we are going to see, you know, a gradual trickle up. The necessity of saying what sex you are, for example, for a range of things, we take it for granted, but why should it be necessary? I mean, it used to be a racial category was put on a driver's license, but we realized how racist that is. And there are movements afoot to take gender off identity documents as well. In Canada, you can now legally get an X. In Australia, I believe you can get an X. But I know that the Gender Free ID Coalition, for example, has asked, just leave it off. Like, why is it necessary? What does it tell us? Like, under what circumstances do people need to know that information? I mean, when registering my child for a dance class, why do they need to know? Like, and the thing is, I've discovered you couldn't. At the community center where my kid wanted to participate in dance, I couldn't register them without saying what sex they were. But nobody could explain to me why that was important information.
Did they get to go to dance class?
Well, I registered them, and they wore what they wanted to wear until they were publicly called out by the teacher during a recital. Yeah, we never went back. You know, that kind of thing can happen. And you know, there are horrific stories that parents have told me and that kids have told me about, you know, what has happened to kids.
So our school district has just passed a SOGI policy, and in that policy it says that you know, students are allowed to join whichever team or group that they want to, whether it's boys basketball or girls basketball or whatever, and not based on gender. My question though is that you're still saying boys and you're still saying girls, and isn't that then kind of forcing students who may not be ready to come out by saying, well, I actually identify this way. So, but because it's not just our district, when they go to zones, when they go to provincials, so that's my question, how do we change it here, but then risk at a zone or at a provincial that somebody's then going to say, well, wait a second, you can't play on this team, and now this person has gone all that way, and I don't know, do we do that at this level to say, well, we just need to take the pronoun away completely? But then what do you put in place of it? Because you still then have an issue of perhaps then if it's a co-ed, then you may not have as many girls going out to play because now they have to play against the boys. Yep. Or play with the boys. So it's a big mess, I think. I'm curious, I would like to see what we can do locally first, like within our own district, like what sort of example do we set, and how do we start that?
Well, right now, most sports are organized with, you know, the International Olympic Committee's criteria trickling down, and whereas, you know, and that's based on a pretty outmoded understanding of biological sex, which has been recently rather successfully contested, which is interesting. But I mean, sports is a really difficult one because people completely take for granted that there are fundamental differences between only two sexes, but there actually aren't. The two-sex system is an ideological construction. It has its own history. There are actually greater differences among people identified as boys, or among people identified as girls, than there are between the so-called average boy and the average girl. But we organize sports to really emphasize sex difference, and it's linked to gender inequality. Remember, sports initially was one of the things that you know, did a lot of the work of patriarchy, of normalizing the idea that men are unique and, you know, capable of certain things while women aren't. And given that kids are going to run into, you know, binary gender systems in sport, it could be tempted to just be fatalistic and say, well, until it changes up there, it doesn't. But I do believe that there are some things worth thinking about. One is that we've seen a real decline in community-oriented sport and physical recreation activities for children in general. Like, one of the things we're seeing is that community centers have been cut back. So that, I mean, I just think in my neighborhood, for kids to participate in Little League Baseball, for example, it's a lot of money. Or hockey or soccer. I mean, when I was a kid, we didn't really have to pay that much to participate in sports. Now, it's really expensive. So you're already excluding a lot of kids just by making it really expensive. And I think that emphasizing the creation of community-based opportunities that are all gender, not co-ed, but all gender, is the way to go. That are also zero cost, so that, you know, every kid can play. You know, for people who are interested in more competitive streams, you know, if they're wanting to compete at the provincial, the national level, or something like that, then they are going to have to, at some point, decide how to handle that. But I think that we give them more resilience in general by providing them with opportunities where they don't have to do that, at least at the outset, locally. Like, there's absolutely no reason why 6-year-old girls and 6-year-old boys are playing soccer separately. Like, none whatsoever. Except if you want to talk about how girls might be more vulnerable or more exposed to sexism and misogyny, which I have also seen. I'm a Little League coach. I interrupt it. But I think we need to also pay attention to the kind of cultures that are present in kids' sports. Kids' sports are not, necessarily a nice place. My son has been, his soccer coach, said, "You look like a bunch of grannies out there. You're not even trying." Naturally, I spoke with him. I said, "Don't ever say that again. Don't tease my son, and don't use women as a put down." Or I've had people say, "Hey, ladies, hurry up." I said, no, you're not doing that. So I think that I also write about sport, you might have gathered. I think that the kind of environment that are provided to kids in sport could use a lot of improvement anyway. And that if we're going to make sports gender neutral for kids, which I really think we should, that also means teaching kids how to behave towards each other. Just like in a lot of ways, a lot of people have a lot of feelings about bathrooms, and there's this fear that a trans person is going to come in the bathroom and attack this child, when in fact the people who are at greatest risk in bathrooms are trans people. But wouldn't it be a really good idea, like starting in kindergarten, when the bathrooms are often gender neutral anyway, to really invest in teaching kids what good bathroom etiquette is like? Just as important as it is to teach boys and girls about consent and about treating each other with courtesy and respect in bathrooms, I think that this is really important cultural work. Yep.
My question to you is, so I know in bigger cities, these conversations happen about transgender issues and such, but I guess when it comes to northern communities or smaller rural areas, how does that conversation start? Or how do you slowly begin to make that a norm, where potentially people might have a lot of backlash towards it, especially given that there's still a lot of racist issues going on in places like this?
Well, I want to start by saying that big cities do not have it together. That most schools and school boards in big cities wait for a visible trans kid to show up to deal with it. And then, if they at least deal with it, I suppose it's good. But the trick is, I think, to not wait for a visible trans kid to show up, but to just keep in mind there are trans kids in every population of kids. What can we do to remove crisis from their daily lives? It means avoiding, saying, okay, boys grab a boy, girls grab a, like just the assumption that there are only boys and girls, or that who they are. Like, stop separating kids on the basis of gender. I think that if you approach it at a systemic level, in whatever organization you're in, if you start being that voice, then it's not easy, but otherwise it's going to be a visible trans kid. And that visible trans kid may or may not do well to be at the forefront. So in a lot of ways, I think that what allies of trans kids can do is just constantly remind ourselves and other people that they're in the room. So this way, that the people that you think are clearly boys, they may never tell you different, but they're not. They just won't tell you. So if you can start changing the way in which children's activities are organized and start educating people who work with children to be more open, then you're going to benefit the invisible trans kids. You just may never know it, so you just kind of have to trust yourself. But like any kind of social change, it's hard work.
That might be a good note to end on, in fact. If you'd like to join me in thanking Ann for coming out and sharing her thoughts and advice with us, we have a small token of our appreciation here.
Well, thank you very much.
Ann said she'd be very interested in continuing continuing the discussion one-on-one or in small groups, and of course there are books for sale and for signing as well. So please do stay. We do have the room. There's no rush to leave, but those of us who do have other engagements can feel free. Oh, and we're pointed out there are still snacks and drinks at the back as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.